Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Beinecke Illuminated. My name is Tubyez Cropper, and I am joined by a wonderful guest today, Tom Bolze. Tom, how are you?
Good, thank you. How are you?
Great. It's been a while since we did another one of these Beinecke Illuminated, and we have a great topic today. So, Tom, let's start with you introducing yourself, what your position is here at the Beinecke, and also what you've been working with.
So my position is catalog librarian, which means that I catalog primarily printed material, although we define it a bit more broadly than that, and it's usually more like published material, but that can be things that are mechanically reproduced. For example, it can be realia. So a little while ago, I cataloged, say, an ashtray from the nightclub El Morocco. But for the most part, it's books, it's serials, we do maps, we do photographs, etc.
Let's talk about your job. You know, a big part of this Beinecke Illuminated podcast is we're looking into who makes all of this happen, right? We have catalogers, we have access service members here, right? We have curators. Tell us a little bit about what goes into cataloging.
Well, you can catalog either an entire collection and do what's called a collection level record, or more of what we do in the rare book cataloging unit is what we call item level. That is, you do a catalog record for each item. So the items we have in front of us have all been cataloged at the item level. And what that entails is you need to examine the item, of course, and determine what makes it both general, say the author, because you can have multiple editions of the same book by the same author, so you have to identify author, title, etc. But then also determine what makes the item that you have in hand unique in the sense of, is it a different edition? Is it, say, the 4th edition of something? Because a reader is going to want to know that, so that has to be in your catalog record. You need the pagination, you need the illustrations. If there's anything really unique to our particular item, such as an autograph, you need to record that in the record. And with things like serials, you need to indicate what issues we hold, because we don't hold the entire run of every serial that we have.
How broad would you say, when it comes to subject headings, how broad do you make those? Are there certain requirements that need to be followed when titling an object? Do you purposefully make them broad enough for people to find? Is there some esoteric piece in there where it is very specific titles and metadata for the average lover of one of these who would know the name, how to find these things? How does that process work?
Sure, it's a good question. It depends on what you've got in hand. You try to be as broad as possible, but you also, as you've mentioned, also want to have enough specificity. And you have to think about that and think about how a researcher might look for something, because there's different terminology that you could use, some of which is broader, some of which is narrower. And that's always a juggling act. You know, how broad and how narrow am I going to get? Because according to the rules, you're not supposed to be totally narrow if you can use something broader. But the broader term might not be something that most people would think about looking for.
Some may know and others may not know. The Beinecke collections are free to the public to use for research, for general curiosity. So the things that we go through today, as for every episode, they are available for viewing. You spoke of erotica. Let's get into it. Why don't we start with our first item here?
Erotica has been in collections for ages, and the first item I have here is one of the classic literary works of erotica. Yeah. It is Memoirs of a Woman of Pleasure by John Cleland, although it was published anonymously. 2 volumes, 1749, and it's better known by the title Fanny Hill. And this is literary, although what I think is kind of fascinating about it, yes, it is standard erotica, it is sexually explicit, but I actually read it not too long ago, and what I found fascinating was that it's got a Bildungsroman quality to it. It's this young woman who's making her way in the world and starting to figure things out, and that's really fascinating. It's more fascinating than some of the erotica sequences.
So when it comes to items like this that have been cataloged prior to the construction of Beinecke, say, is there additional work that needs to be done on these items? Do you have to go back, change metadata, change titles, change what collection it may belong to, things of that nature?
Sometimes yes. It depends on how the cataloging was done, and how much more information. We don't habitually go back and do it. It's not something that's systematic.
Right.
But if a curator is working with some material and says, this has not been cataloged very well, and it may have been cataloged fine for its time. Remember that something like this and anything that was at Yale before, I don't know, circa 2000, was using catalog cards. So there was only so much information you could fit on that. Right. So yes, you may want to put more information in. The name of an author may have been identified. Again, like I said, this is anonymous. And we'll talk about that a little bit more with Tijuana Bibles.
All right. Let's go on to the next item.
Sure. So the next item is material that I did catalog some of it, and we're going into the 20th century because that's the area that I find most interesting, because although literary erotica is great, I love the more ephemeral pop culture material that appears in the 20th century. Partly because this is the type of material that it provides evidence for communities that some of the literary material doesn't. And it's very ephemeral. It's amazing that it has survived. So one of my favorites is the Tijuana Bibles, which we have here. I've pulled out 3 distinct titles. I would love to flip through them, but I cannot, because Tijuana Bibles are basically sexually explicit comic books. Right. So they wouldn't be very friendly for a public audience. But they're great fun in the sense that they begin in the late 1920s. And really they, Art Spiegelman, the well-known cartoonist who wrote Mouse, has argued that these were the first true comic books in the United States. And he also claims that they actually formed a type of sex education manual for young men. Distorted, of course, because that's just the nature of erotica. But in from the late 1920s and into the 1930s, which was the heyday of Tijuana Bibles, there weren't a whole lot of other sources. Now, these do seem to have been written for men, by men. But the 3 I pulled out here are from the 1930s. Again, this is the heyday of the Tijuana Bibles. So the first one is Flash Gordon in Red Hot. Flash Gordon is a Sunday Comics creation, first appears in 1934. And the Sunday Comics were a tremendous source of inspiration for the Tijuana Bible artists. Popeye, Flash Gordon, Blondie. So they just had a field day with these. Now, Tijuana Bibles are very underground. There are no known publishers. You'll see things on them occasionally saying published in Havana. That's a load of malarkey. They were probably produced in the US, but they were very underground. You bought them under the counter at the barber shop or something like that. Another one that has a tentative identification is this one. It started in the subway and ended in the Bronx. The catalog record for that says circa 1935, but I think that's closer to 1940 because it's in the style of a number of Tijuana Bibles that were done about the 1939 New York World's Fair. And the artist for that has been tentatively identified as a man named Wesley Morse. And Mr. Morse is much better known from the 1950s. He had great success as the original Bazooka Joe bubblegum comics artist. So great stuff there. And then finally, Katharine Hepburn in Belle of the Hills. Again, 1930s probably. Movie stars were another big source of inspiration for Tijuana Bible artists. Cary Grant, Greta Garbo. Mae West was really popular, but here we see Connecticut native Katharine Hepburn being parodied. So these are from the heyday of Tijuana Bibles. Tijuana Bibles continued until into the 1960s, but really after World War II, they were slowly fading out, partly because things like Playboy appear in 1953, and obscenity laws are gradually loosening up. And by the way, the term Tijuana Bible is not the only term for these. That seems to be a Southern California term, because Tijuana, Mexico was viewed as a place of illicit pleasure. In the 1920s, you could go there to drink legally, which you couldn't in the US because of Prohibition. You could go there to gamble. It was sort of Vegas before Vegas. So it has this long-standing reputation as being a place where you went to have fun.
There is a lot of curiosity here for these items, and the pop culture references in this, and the interesting correlation of using very prominent and positively connotated stars and putting them in these dirty erotic things, right? It really just shows the American culture, right?
Well, and that's a good point, because
Right.
they also have many of the flaws of the American culture of their period. They are racist, they are sexist, they are derogatory of practically every ethnic group, but they're also derogatory of everybody, and they are surprisingly humorous. And what I think is really interesting, and I'd be curious whether you and Michael feel similarly, they are much less violent than erotica later in the 20th century. They are almost naive in some ways, which can be charming if you can overlook all of those other flaws.
Right, yeah. And
So-
what about censorship?
Well, they're very underground.
Right.
So they can't be, in fact, that's why you could parody stars, because who's going to sue you? Who is there to sue? You can't identify anybody. They were seized. You know, if I've seen reports where if the local liquor store in the 1930s, you know, if you bought them under the counter at the liquor store and the police found out about it, they would seize them.
Gotcha.
But in terms of censoring them, how do you censor something that isn't going through any official channels to begin with?
Right.
Jumping into the 50s, once the Tijuana Bibles are fading out, the 50s are such an interesting period, because on the one hand, they seem very conservative in a lot of ways, but on the other hand, you've got things like Playboy suddenly appearing. And one of the things that is fascinating is a phenomenon such as female impersonation, which today we almost automatically associate with male homosexuality. In the 50s, the associations are there, but they can still perform in public venues without it raising too much of an eyebrow. So for example, here we have a program for a major female impersonation troupe called the Jewel Box Revue. This is probably 1955 to 1960. And the Jewel Box Revue was the best known traveling troupe of female impersonators. It was founded in 1939. Continued until the 1970s, played throughout the country. They started in Miami. They played in Seattle, Dallas, most famously at the Apollo in New York. There is some question in my mind how much they were able to play in the South, because what's interesting about the Jewel Box Revue is they played black as well as white theaters, and they were a somewhat racially integrated troupe. And I've seen things that said they could not play in the South, but then I've seen other things that said they showed up in Dallas. Whether or not they were in places like Atlanta or Birmingham, I don't know. So there's a little bit of mystery there that I'm sure other scholars have explored. So there's one of the impersonators, Jackie May. The Jewel Box, also from 1955 to 1969, all of the performers were female impersonators except for their MC. Their MC was a male impersonator by the name of Stormy DeLarvery, and Stormy was a woman of mixed race. Her father was white and her mother was black, She was very light. In fact, I heard a recording of her once where she said she had a white face, but she seems to have identified as black throughout her life. And in fact, she was bullied as a child because of her parentage. She was also what we would today consider a very masculine lesbian, and she looked great as a male impersonator. She was just wonderful. And here you can see she has actually signed this copy of the Jewel Box Revue program, which is great. So this, of course, is not erotica. This is a souvenir program that you would get. But I think there is probably, at the time that you would go to see the Jewel Box, there was probably a slightly risque component of just going to it. It's a little, you know, it's not just like going to the local nightclub. You're doing something a little different. I'm not sure about the Jewel Box performances themselves. Everything I've seen suggests that they were really conventional and glamorous. But I know that some female impersonators who were performing in smaller nightclubs in this period tended to have slightly titillating repartee. You know, lots of double entendres, that kind of stuff. I don't know if the Jewel Box did that. I get the sense that maybe they didn't, but it may have depended on the venue as well.
And these were, I assume, sold out shows whenever they came to town. Was it, I mean, I don't know how knowledgeable you are just sort of cataloging these things, but from what I'm seeing, it seemed like a full night out, right? This was something you prepared for and you look forward to later in the night, right?
Oh, yes. Yes, I do think this would have been sort of, in many places, kind of a nightclub venue. The Apollo would have been different because that's a more formal theater.
Right.
But I know, for example, in 1957, they played in a place in Niagara Falls called Luigi's Supper Club. So definitely a night out. Yeah. You know, you're going for dinner, you're going for the show. Whether they were sold out, how popular they were, I can't tell you that. I'm assuming they were quite popular because they lasted for 36 years.
Right. Yeah. And now it's a very prominent thing. I mean, you know, now, I mean, looking at this and the documentation here and looking at, you know, where we are now with TV shows, right, movies, full performances, full venues that are dedicated to these type of things, right? It's amazing to see just a few decades later that it
came back. Yeah. No, it was very funny when I first discovered Jewel Box Revue in the early 90s and was doing some more in-depth research on female impersonation. It was fascinating to me that on the one hand you had this moment in the 50s when things like this were pretty popular, and at that same moment it was coming back with RuPaul. It's like, wow. This is a little bit of deja vu. Yeah. That is one of the arguments with the Jewel Box Revue, that it kind of helps set the tone or create the changes in queer sensibility that give rise to the Stonewall uprising. And in fact, Stormy DeLarvery was at Stonewall. Folklore says she threw the first punch, but that's tricky because it's such a chaotic event. Right. Do we know who threw the first punch? And she left the Jewel Box Revue in the same year as Stonewall, I think a couple months after Stonewall, and became a very well-known figure in New York. She was the bouncer at a couple of lesbian bars. She was very prominent in the lesbian community in New York, and she had a good long life. She didn't die until 2014. So, wow. An amazing person.
And now on to the next?
On to the next. Let's move into the 60s. This item, I'm sorry, I don't speak Swedish, so I can't pronounce it in Swedish, although it may have been an English title to begin with. So I'll just say it for the way it looks to me, Expedition 66. This was a short-lived Swedish magazine. It only seems to have run for 4 issues in 1966. The editor and publisher was a woman named Nina Eston. That is her there. Nina Eston was a feminist. And in fact, this may be the first magazine erotica by women for women. Like I said, it only seems to have run for about 4 issues, and the later erotica that was pitched to women, magazines like Viva and Playgirl, even though they had women editors and women contributors, they were owned by men, which tended to color how they approached things. In fact, Viva was owned by Bob Guccione, who actually viewed it as penthouse for women. No. So I love the fact that we have this because it is, to me, very important. It's kind of a milestone.
Right.
Last but not least, as you are well aware, everything I've shown so far is 20th century, but Beinecke collects well into the present. So this final item was published in 2000. It's No Mercy by Pat Califia. It is a collection of short stories with a largely lesbian and transgender focus. Erotic short stories, I should say. Pat Califia now goes by Patrick Califia and identifies as a bisexual trans man. But at the time this was written, he identified as a lesbian, as well as an activist and a journalist and a therapist. So, and did I mention that he goes by Patrick now? I can't remember. So he's a very interesting character who kind of has a long history as a writer. I remember the name from when I was in grad school 30 years ago, and he's just long been associated with works related to various unconventional and transgressive sexuality. So it's just nice to have that and Fanny Hill framing the 20th century.
I want to thank you, Tom, for coming on and speaking about your work, all the great work you've been doing. And is there anything else that you'd like to say about the collections, about Beinecke, about anything, just to end off this segment?
The only thing I would like to say is the reading room is now open. Please come use the material.
Amen to that.
Thank you for the opportunity. This has been fun.
Of course. Thank you. Thank you for watching another episode of Beinecke Illuminated. We'll see you in the next one.